My name is Michael Krasny. I have a PhD in literature from the University of Wisconsin and have been a professor of English at San Francisco State University since 1970. I also host a weekday news, public affairs, and culture and arts and science talk program on the National Public Radio affiliate, KQED Radio in San Francisco. It will be my pleasurable task to take you on, well, let's call it a conversation with great authors through a series of lectures on stories by some of the world's greatest writers, who will immerse you in their worlds and affect your minds and hearts as only great stories can. The value of studying stories like the ones we will be studying is in the simple fact that they transport our imaginations. They heighten our senses and consciousness and yield insight, knowledge, and, we hope, wisdom. What discipline, really other than fiction, combines nearly every other area of knowledge in its study and also provides a reality that many believe to be superior in its overall effects on what we normally believe reality to be? We read and interpret stories to enter into the exciting life of the mind and to see. As the poet Adrian Rich said, what we see, and seeing is changing. Let's have a brief look at the short story and its history, the arc of the stories we will be studying, and a consideration of how we interpret meaning and evaluate fiction. Edgar Allan Poe defined the short story generally as not being as long as a novel or novella, or what at one time later on would be called a novelette. In other words, short enough to read and absorb in a single setting. Short stories can be anywhere up to around 15,000 words if you're word counting, but defining a short story is a little bit like, well, the idea of putting Jell-O on a tree. But a short story should grab you, should engage you, rivet you into what Gabriel Rossetti called a moment's monument. You read stories, usually one at a time, and if they are great or even good, they keep you reading right up until the end. J.D. Salinger, the famed author of The Catcher in the Rye, once said he was a dash man and not a long-distance runner, though he did write one short novel during his career before turning to collections of short stories. Short story writers run the dash, but novelists are the long-distance runners. Short fiction has a long pedigree, a history of the tale going back to oral narratives and oral storytelling, and oral history, but also located in myths and biblical stories, and the anecdotes of ancient Rome. They have their origins also in fables, folktales with moral exempla built in, like Aesop, who gave us such famous fables as The Tortoise and the Hare. Western and European stories and tales have their origins in poetic forms of the 14th century, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron. We'll see in a number of the short fiction writers who we'll be discussing works of short fiction that, like the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales, fit into larger works. There are stories that are read and taught as stories that are, in fact, part of the much broader canvas of a novel, but that can nevertheless stand alone as short stories. The modern short story bloomed in the 19th century with the market created by journals and magazines, often shocking or horror stories like the Grimm fairy tales or German tales of shock and horror. In the United States, these were the stories of Washington Irving, the most famous being the ones about the legendary Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, and the tale of Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep when King George is ruling the colonies and wakes up 20 years later to the visage of General George Washington. Short fiction appeared and flourished nearly simultaneously in the United States and Russia. It flourished later in France, where Poe was greatly admired, and later still in the British Empire, where big novels, often serialized, held sway. In Ireland and in German-speaking Europe, where medium-length novellas had been more the norm for short fiction. The trajectory of storytelling, as we look at the masters of 2 centuries, moves from simple, highly plotted tales to increasing realism, putting the mirror up to nature, and then to forms of experimentation and an increased opening up in fiction to the complexities of modern life, psychological, racial, ethnic, sexual, and identity-based. That is, there's a movement from realism to modernism, from realism with some elements of the allegorical or moral tale, the fabulous tale, based on myth and fable, and the surreal tales built from the unconscious mind, to more modernist stories, both steeped in realism or built on fabulism and parable, myth, self-reflexivity, autobiography, or history. Voices change as writers open up to younger voices, ethnicity, and gender, and what we see in the evolution of short fiction masterpieces is a changing canon. That's the established body of what is deemed to be great literature, and a changing marketplace that is increasingly cross-cultural, cosmopolitan, and global. The key to understanding stories is often vested in what we call intertextuality, stories building on other stories through the progression of time and many of them continuing to possess within them related themes and ideas and similar elements of expression, such as the use of allegory. We also see stories that draw us in by making us wonder what is coming next, to stories that have more to do with characters being revealed or revealing themselves, stories that leave things out, and stories that include pointed details and small observations, stories that are more like drama, as we'll see in the great storyteller Chekhov, who was also a dramatist, and stories that are, well, more like poetry, even up to and including so-called confessional poetry like that of Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, or Sylvia Plath, American poets of the post-World War II era who explored personal terrain through the creation of characters who confess the secret content of their hidden inner lives. What we want is to discover what makes the stories we'll be discussing great, and why and how they yield richness of meaning, and, in addition to interpretation, how we evaluate their worth. This can sometimes be challenging, even vexing. But there are essentially four major ways of interpreting and evaluating short fiction, and each of the four is intimately connected to craft and to the tale's impact on readers. These are four good touchstones to assessing what a masterpiece is. First, there's the text, looking at the language in the story, its metaphors, symbolism, meanings that we can attribute to the author's choice of words. We'll read text between about 1,000 and 15,000 words. Secondly, the author, his or her personal history and psychology, influences and cultural background, all of which can and often do go beyond and outside the text. We're going to read 23 stories in depth by 6 authors, born in the first half of the 19th century, and 6 born in the second half, and 11 born in the first half of the 20th century. English is where the development of short fiction has been most firmly planted, and we'll read writers from Canada to South Africa to New Zealand, as well as 10 or 11 stories by U.S. authors, and another 5 or 6 by authors from throughout the rest of the English-speaking world, depending on how you count Henry James, an American-born writer who was an expatriate in England. The remaining stories are by authors who were Russian, French, and Czech or German, depending on where you want to place Franz Kafka, and South American. Third, the reader. How does the story affect you as a reader? How the role of the reader has changed through the course of the history of short fiction we will also take into account. And as stories become more sophisticated and modern, the role of the reader becomes more collaborative. And finally, mimetic reality. That is, how does the story depict or otherwise represent, mime, what we distill as reality, with all the major changes brought in by world wars, and industrialization, and technology, and seismic shifts in mores. Selections of stories that we're going to discuss are based on historic and canonical considerations of great critical acclaim, and the inclusion of individual stories that have appeared in a wide range of anthologies and fiction volumes. The accepted taste of literary criticism and literary scholarship is a stock market, obviously in flux and up for debate. Somerset Maugham and Robert Louis Stevenson were once high on the stock exchange of short fiction writers, while William Faulkner and F. Scott Fitzgerald were not. Writers' reputations change and shift. But the greatness attributable to short fiction is directly tied to authorial genius and the effect and impact of the story on a wide range of readers, to the universality of the story's themes and ideas, its emotional and empathic and evocative power, its originality, and frankly, on this professor's scholarly and personal choices. Greatness is also inextricably linked to form and content, language, or what's called stylistics, and craft, and to the meaning that the individual story yields, how and to what degree it moves or stirs us, and how or to what extent it lasts or is likely to endure. When I was in graduate school, we used to have the notion that there would be a space capsule that would go into the future. What works would we want to include in that space capsule? As if we could decide somehow what would be the best works for ongoing generations. But what better place to begin a course on masterpieces of short fiction than with the earliest American master of suspense, Edgar Allan Poe, who has given us such classic stories as The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Cask of Amontillado, which is the first story we will focus on. We begin with Poe in this course because of his emphasis on plot and unity, and a credible-sounding, though quite possibly unreliable, narrator. And we move through stories of greater realism and more open plots. Sometimes no plots at all, as we venture also into some of the experimental fiction of the 20th century. Poe was also a seminal figure in the ushering in of detective stories, even years before those world-famous British detective Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, who started writing detective fiction nearly a half-century after Poe. Poe was also an early contributor to science fiction stories with Malanta Tonta in 1840, and other work of his including The 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade. In short, Poe pioneered three distinct genres of short fiction. Today, Poe might be classified as a commercial writer, despite his lack of commercial success, a woeful lack, I might add, and there still exists a Rubicon in the mind of many literary critics between popular or pulp fiction for the masses and more literary or aesthetically imbued fiction for the higher brow reader. As we'll discover, these are often indistinct lines that can be grossly exaggerated. We begin with Poe also because Poe was a pathfinding theorist of the short story who grounds us in a theory of short fiction and its effects. He wrote an early disputation, one of the earliest on record, about the singular effect of the short story. The importance of the single effect in a prose tale was published in 1842, and in it, Poe used Nathaniel Hawthorne as an example of a storyteller who provides what only the short story can provide for a reader. Unlike the novel, with a story like the Cask of Amontillado, Poe's great tale of suspense and revenge, the effects on us as readers emerge from a single sitting. Only a handful of pages and Poe transports us to a world of masquerades and motley, a carnivalesque world of conical caps and bells, and then into an underground world of catacombs and skeletons, and into what appears to be a perfect crime, a grotesque and calculated premeditated murder. A live burial narrated by the murderer from the perch of a half-century later. The emphasis in this story is on plot, a compressed narrative that comes to us through the authentic and riveting voice of a murderer. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length, I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado?" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me Lucchese cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." So you see how he tells his story in terms of it being in the present, even though it is from that half-century before. And you get a sense of a very distinctive voice here, telling us how he ensnared this man, how he really entrapped him, got him to come with him into the catacombs, which is where they go essentially with Montrezor deciding that he's going to seal him up in there and bury him alive. But it's all very friendly at first. It's all very, in fact, he says he shakes his hand and is so delighted to see him, as if you think, this guy's going to murder him. Why is he so pleased? He's so pleased because he's getting his revenge. But outwardly, of course, is the appearance of being warm, friendly, wanting his advice, but, well, I'll go to Lucchese instead, maybe he knows, and just ensnaring him with that sense that Lucchese is a better wine taster than you might be, Fortunato. As is elemental in fiction, Montrezor, the voice of the story, is our protagonist, main character. Fortunato, his antagonist, the man he wants to murder. And murder, as he says, with impunity. That's the source of all the action in the story. This is what many consider a perfect short story, and Poe's best, a psychological journey into the mind of a murderer. Original, carefully crafted, with readers experiencing the horror as the murderer entraps his prey and literally seals him up in a niche tier by tier with stones and mortar. Montrezor may indeed be mad, but he's credible. And from the outset, we're swept up into a story of shock and horror that is relentless. The ultimate terrifying campfire story. It appeared, by the way, a year after Poe's famous poem, The Raven, and just after the last of his 3 detective stories. Poe is seminal, as I said. He's a poet, as well as an editor, a novelist, as well as a short story writer, an essayist. Let's talk about his background a little. He was actually expelled from West Point, and he lived a life afflicted by poverty, poor health, depression, and addiction. His wife, Virginia Clem, who was also his 13-year-old first cousin, died young. And though his stories sold well all over the world, and he published some 70 tales, his literary income as a short story writer never exceeded hundreds of dollars. Let's look at what makes Poe's horror story great by starting with the fact that the story is a perfect example of what Poe's aesthetic theory of a single sitting was based on. That is, the belief in the overall effect of reading a work in one sitting. Poe also believed that truth is the aim of the tale, and he was doubtlessly influenced by the classic thinking we see in the Poetics by Aristotle, the notion that great literary art, specifically tragedy, creates a cathartic or purging effect of pity and terror, and reveals the hubris or pride of characters. The Cask of Amontillado reflects the Aristotelian notion of catharsis, of pity and fear, and the 2 main characters in different ways are suffused with hubris or pride, one in his wine connoisseurship, the other in what he relates as his perfect murder. The essential conflict of revenge is sustained from the story's beginning to its conclusion and manages to move through time in accordance with another Aristotelian precept, the unity of time. The fact that all of the action in the story takes place within a set unity of time, even though it's told from the perspective of a half-century later. The plot is driven by a single incident with a startling and decisive conclusion that involves a man being buried alive in a story propelled by character, Montrezor's character. Montrezor, the murderer, creates ambiguities for his readers, whom he appears to be directly confiding in after 50 years from the murderous act. Passage I just read where he says, "You who know my soul so well." Who's he addressing that to, if not us as readers? Why is he telling this story now? And to whom? To us? Maybe to someone else? What are his real motives? And just how reliable is his version of what occurred in the nitro-filled underground where he lures with the wonderful sherry Amontillado a man who thinks he is a friend? Well, Montrezor may be unreliable, possibly insane, morally deficient, or evil. He tells the story with clearly mixed emotions that he quite possibly doesn't understand himself. The setting and the atmosphere of the story in Europe during the madness and festive masquerade-filled carnival season above ground shifts with dramatic intensity as we move into the underground world of the catacombs. This is part of the psychological nature of the tale and its architecture of the mind, as if we're entering the unconscious or taking the lid off id, moving to a realm below the surface of our outward actions to strong, universal themes that embrace our unconscious motives. There was a woman named Princess Maria Bonaparte who was a patient of Freud's and a psychoanalytic critic, and she said in her analysis of the Cask of Amontillado that we see all these wine bottles and these are obviously phallic symbols. Well, Freud also was at one point given to reminding us that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But this story does get us into deep psychological levels, psychoanalytical levels, if you will. And the relationship of the tale to the reader is complex and really quite artful. Montrezor even seems to be directly addressing us, as I said, and we can all be cast a bit like Fortunato, dressed up as fools in a similar role, because you, the reader of the story, like Fortunato, are being left to try to guess what plot is unfolding. You're experiencing a mounting irrational fear and emotion and disbelief with the rising action of the story, and you're ensnared into the story. I want to talk about the origins of this story. It goes back to Poe supposedly hearing an anecdote while serving in the army in 1827 about a lieutenant who was killed in a duel by a young bully of a captain. The lieutenant, while intoxicated, was allegedly sealed up alive. Poe, we should also remember, was poor, very sick, and the story resonates with class difference and class envy. Montrezor seems to have fallen. He says of Fortunato that you are happy as I once was, rich, respected, admired, beloved, as I once was. Fortunato, as in the word fortune, is noble, and Lucchese, the other wine connoisseur who's mentioned in the story, has a name which suggests lucre or money. Poe had neither fortune nor money. And his stepfather, John Allen, who adopted Poe after Poe's father died when Poe was only 3, was, like Fortunato, a Mason, as well as a man who considered himself a wine connoisseur. Fortunato exclaims to Montrezor, not without contempt, "You, impossible, a Mason?" And Montrezor becomes a different kind of Mason as he uses a trowel to build tears that will suffocate Fortunato. Perhaps psychobiographers who look for meaning in the life of the author might argue Poe was wreaking a kind of vengeance on his stepfather, as well as for the impoverished and unhappy life he lived. The great Argentinian fiction writer Jorge Luis Borges pithily once said of Poe, "He lived a short and unhappy life, if unhappiness can be short." The story was published in 1846 in Godey's Lady's Book, a popular mid-19th century venue for short fiction, which also published Hawthorne, and reflects the popular interest in stories that carry sensation and horror, and stories of revenge. This popular interest in stories that convey both horror and sensation continues to the present day, and interestingly enough was reflected in an episode of the television series Homicide, based on the Cask of Amontillado, in which, as a kind of tribute to Poe, and the show's setting in Baltimore, where Poe once lived, a character seals another character up alive. Poe continues, to the present day, to have many imitators and admirers in both the literary and the popular cultures. I want to do some analysis now of the Cask of Amontillado. D.H. Lawrence saw it as a tale of hatred and murderousness, but envy is a strong motif, and we never know what any of the 1,000 injuries Montrezor has suffered are, or the insult that precipitated his lust for revenge. An insult to family honor appears to be tied in, and the reader is immersed into a world of coats of arms and family mottos, traditions that carry on for centuries as the dead linger in their repose. Punishing with impunity is the course set upon by Montrezor to bring his revenge to fruition. And the story engages us in questions of justice, both here on earth and the theological variety. Fortunato exclaims and Montrezor repeats, "For the love of God." This story, we should always remember, is built on irony. Montrezor, for example, early on gives explicit orders, he tells us, to his attendants not to leave the house, knowing that that will ensure that they will. Psychologically astute of him, to be sure. Fortunato says early on to Montrezor that his cough, that is, Fortunato's cough, will not kill him. "My cough won't kill me," he says, and Montrezor replies, "True, true." Montrezor offers a toast to Fortunato's long life. And the supreme irony may be in the lack of understanding on Montrezor's part of the effect of the murder on his own conscience, from his smiling at the thought of Fortunato's immolation to his admission later on in the story that his heart grows sick, and he blames it on the dampness of the catacombs. That's where we get into even a deeper psychology. If his heart is growing sick and he says it must be because of the dampness of the catacombs, are we to believe him? Or is he perhaps unreliable? Is his conscience or his unconscious playing a role in perhaps precipitating some guilt? There are weaknesses in this story, despite its singular effect and the building up to its climactic impact. It's histrionic. It has what can be described as, I suppose, a puerile style. Henry James called it primitive, and T.S. Eliot called Poe gifted but before puberty. The characters are not flat, but they are somewhat psychologically abstract, and there's a sense of gimmickry or manipulation that Poe uses that some deem non-literary. Montrezor, after all, does pull us in through Poe's ventriloquist manipulation of him manipulating us as readers, and it can seem a bit heavy-handed on Poe's part. But that, we realize, is just what a good or great story, especially a suspense story, is supposed to do. You could almost say it's a suspense or horror storyteller's mandate. The story remains a masterpiece because of its totality and its seminal role in masterful storytelling. What may appear somewhat crude in Poe becomes more stylized and highly developed as the genre of short fiction develops. Julio Cortázar, a short story writer who wrote a book on the beginnings of the modern short story, viewed the Cask of Amontillado as a perfect story and wrote about its successful, insistent race against the clock. Poe sets us up for precisely what Cortázar describes. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montrezors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It's farther on," said I, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with two filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitra?" he asked at length. "Nitra," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" And here we have Fortunato coughing. My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious." We know, of course, that he's ensnaring him. He's bringing him in, and it moves us forward, as I said, in a relentless way. He's playing with them. It's like a spider and a fly, saying, "Oh, well, you're coughing. We'll take you back. We'll go back," and so forth. But we know we're moving on, and indeed we do march on. And revenge is, let's face it, a powerful and universal human emotion. It's what pulls us in, even though we don't know why this man is seeking revenge against Fortunato, our narrator. A man is buried alive for reasons that we can't discern, and the very lawlessness of that act, done by someone who has managed to conceal his true lethal motives, is terrifying. It affects us. Plus, there are so many skeletons down there in that subterranean vault. You may remember, in fact, those of you who remember Hamlet, when the gravedigger holds up the skull and says, "Poor Yorick, I knew him well." That's what we call in literature a memento mori. That is, a remembrance to us of our own mortality. When you have a lot of skeletons in a subterranean vault, it's hard not to think of your own mortality. The story's first 3 paragraphs really serve as a perfect setting up or exposition of all that follows in rising and falling action. And the voice in the story is masterfully sustained. It keeps us compelled to stay with the story right up to the end. I want to, in fact, just read an excerpt from the end of the story. "It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, 'Ha, ha, ha, he, he, a very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, he, he, over our wine, he, he. The Amontillado,' I said. He, he. Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montrezor!" "Yes," I said, "for the love of God!" But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. Well, I had a mentor and professor named Walter Tevis, who gained some fame by writing a novel called The Hustler, all about pool shooting, and made into a movie, a famous movie. Also was the author of The Color of Money and The Man Who Fell to the Earth. And he used to say, Edgar Allan Poe, the father of American junk, all that tintintabulation that you hear in some of his poetry. But it really has little to do with Poe as a short story writer. Even the American novelist and short story writer E.L. Doctorow, whose father named him Edgar after Poe, and who also said that Poe was one of our junkie writers, was really talking more about Poe the poet, Once Upon a Midnight Dreary, and all that scary stuff, creepy stuff about dead young women by the sea. Beautiful young woman to Poe was the most aesthetically moving thing of all, and as I said, he was married to this 13-year-old cousin who died young. But Poe was a master storyteller, and it should make you want to read more Poe, both poetry and short fiction, because his poetry is well worth reading too, even if you think it's junky. Read more fiction like The Telltale Heart if you haven't, or The Fall of the House of Usher. You also might want to read Washington Irving to see how Poe avoided the meandering quality in Irving's tales, which helped establish him as by many accounts the seminal figure in the modern short story. Poe's heirs are popular writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King and Shirley Jackson, whom we'll be talking about, masters of the horror story. And next for us, two other great horror storytellers who shift the boundaries of the natural world, into encounters with the world of the supernatural. We see in the next pair of authors we're going to study, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Nikolai Gogol, more didacticism than we see in Poe. Remember that Horace, one of the earliest literary critics of ancient Rome, said that the purpose of literature is to teach as well as to please or entertain. With Poe, it's mostly about the pleasing or the entertaining. Horror can be entertaining, as we see in all too many scary movies and TV shows. Writers like Hawthorne and Gogol entertain us, they scare us with horror, but they also stretch realism and credibility and become more moralizing than Poe. You might ask the question, why is early fiction so fixated on horror? Well, because magazines were where horror stories appeared. Magazines were where stories appeared, and horror was what magazine writers craved, what magazine readers craved. Could a writer make readers quake in fear with the notion that one could actually murder with impunity, escape moral or eternal judgment as secularism and loss of faith continue to rise? Well, the Cask of Amontillado is a realistic, true-to-life story, a well-made tale driven by plot and a realism, or what we call verisimilitude, being true to life, that will dominate the 19th century, even though with Hawthorne and Gogol we see stories that veer off into the supernatural. The Cask of Amontillado is Gothic, gloomy, grotesque, and violent, an arabesque, intricate in its design, but it cleaves to standards of realism, as do the other masters of the well-made tale of the 19th century, like Guy de Maupassant, Anton Chekhov, and Henry James, who wrote a famous supernatural, haunting ghost story called The Turn of the Screw. Despite the ventures into the supernatural in Hawthorne and Gogol and a seminal writer like Washington Irving, we remain largely tethered in 19th century storytelling to a strong sense of realism and credibility. Stories, as we shall see, become more complicated in craft and technique and in character. Great stories are connected to other great stories and build on their predecessors in a tapestry of intertextuality. Poe and Hawthorne admired and wrote about each other's work, and our next lecture will be on Hawthorne, another of the great 19th century American storytellers, and author of a tale that is generally regarded as his most compelling. The sense of fiendishness, the frightful, the horrific, and the demonic, as you'll see, resonates in this other American master as well. But we owe a lion's share of credit to Poe for masterfully bringing us into the world we recognize as that of the genre of the short story, and of providing much of, well, forgive the apt metaphor, the mortar and masonry that created for us a whole new way of envisioning fiction. We now want to look at one of the most indelible and famous of all American short stories, Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a story that's often characterized as a moral allegory, meaning abstract meaning comes through the story and emerges through the fictional characters who serve as symbols for higher moral truths. This is the territory Hawthorne is so famous for and works so well with, and succeeds in this tale particularly. The allegory in Young Goodman Brown is one based on an archetypal journey. It's an initiation story of an everyman character who goes from innocence to experience, from faith to loss of faith. And the name Goodman was common and nearly universal, comparable to Mr. today, but it's also indicative in this allegory of a good man who, in this story, encounters evil. The roots of Hawthorne's story go back to allegorical morality plays, such as the 15th century English Everyman or John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, which appeared in 1678. Goodman Brown's wife, Faith, is left behind after keeping Goodman back a while and leaving him thinking, after this one night, that he will cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven. The story then plunges Goodman Brown into a primeval forest on an errand or mission, a journey, the purpose of which is never made clear. Brown meets a man with a staff which bears a likeness to a great black snake, and the man turns out to be the devil, who tells Brown, contrary to Brown's belief in his lineage, which he believes is from honest men who were good Christians, that Brown's ancestors were complicitous in the lashing of a Quaker woman through the streets of Salem and in the setting of fire to an Indian village. Hawthorne was born in the infamous Salem, Massachusetts, and descended from ancestors who actually participated in the Salem witch trials and who believed in a stern form of Puritanism tied to the teachings of John Calvin. Hawthorne's ancestor was William Hawthorne, a colonial magistrate who persecuted Quakers, and William Hawthorne's son, John, was a Puritan investigator of those accused of witchcraft. Young Goodman Brown is often read as a personal story of Hawthorne's rendering of his own ancestral heritage and the sense of guilt he felt about it. But before we venture further into Hawthorne's life or to a greater understanding of Calvinism, let us go back into the forest and discuss the essence of what occurs in this strangely mesmerizing and powerful horror story of moral guilt and good and evil. The devil informs Brown that he, Satan, has had close connections with some of the most outwardly moral and exemplary and upstanding citizens. And this is soon borne out by the appearance of the woman who taught Brown his catechisms as a youth, as well as by the presence in the forest of the town deacon and minister. What can these religious figures be doing in the woods in the darkness of night? Well, having, it turns out, a black Sabbath, a communion with the devil, whom Goodman Brown believes he can resist and stand firm against, quote, with heaven above and faith below, end quote. But it turns out that faith, like all of the townspeople of Salem, both religious and irreligious, the powerful and the pariah, are of one assembly with the devil. So you can get used to Hawthorne's prose style here. It goes back to the proverbial Puritan. "My faith is gone," cried he after one stupefied moment. "There is no good on earth, and sin is but a name. Come, devil, for thee is this world given." And maddened with despair, so that he laughed loud and long, did Goodman Brown grasp his staff and set forth again, at such a rate that he seemed to fly along the forest path rather than to walk or to run. The road grew wilder and drearier and more faintly traced, and vanished at length, leaving him in the heart of the dark wilderness, still rushing onward with the instinct that guides mortal man to evil. Let me stop there, because that really sums up much of the theology of Hawthorne and the Puritans. There's an instinctual nature, an innate nature that drives men and women, to evil. The whole forest was peopled with frightful sounds, the creaking of the trees, the howling of wild beasts, and the yell of Indians. While sometimes the wind tolled like a distant church bell, and sometimes gave a broad roar around the traveler, as if all nature were laughing him to scorn. But he was himself the chief horror of the scene, and shrank not from its other horrors. In other words, what's in the mortal heart, this evil that we carry around in us in a demonic way, is even far more evil, perhaps, as Hawthorne saw things and as he portrays things here, than the devil and what the devil can wreak. "Ha, ha, ha," roared Goodman Brown when the wind laughed at him. "Let us hear which will laugh loudest. Think not to frighten me with your deviltry. Come witch, come wizard, come Indian powwow, come devil himself, and here comes Goodman Brown. You may as well fear him as he fear you." In truth, all through the haunted forest there could be nothing more frightful than the figure of Goodman Brown. On he flew among the black pines, brandishing his staff with frenzied gestures, now giving vent to an inspiration of horrid blasphemy, and now shouting forth such laughter as set all the echoes of the forest laughing like demons around him. The fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. And there it is, explicitly delivered to us by Hawthorne. Thus sped the demonic on his course, until, quivering among the trees, he saw a red light before him, as when the felled trunks and branches of a clearing have been set on fire, and throw up their lurid blaze against the sky at the hour of midnight. So we're at the witch's hour here, literally. And he paused in a lull of the tempest that had driven him onward, and heard the swell of what seemed a hymn rolling solemnly from a distance with the weight of many voices. He knew the tune. It was a familiar one in the choir of the village meeting house. The verse died heavily away and was lengthened by a chorus, not of human voices, but of all the sounds of the benighted wilderness pealing in awful harmony together. Goodman Brown cried out, and his cry was lost to his own ear by its unison with the cry of the desert. In the interval of silence, he stole forward until the light glared full upon his eyes. At one extremity of an open space, hemmed in by the dark wall of the forest, arose a rock, bearing some rude natural resemblance either to an altar or a pulpit, and surrounded by 4 blazing pines, their tops aflame, their stems untouched, like candles at an evening meeting. The massive foliage that had overgrown the summit of the rock was all on fire, blazing high into the night and fitfully illuminating the whole field. Even pendant twig and leafy festoon was in a blaze. As the red light arose and fell, a numerous congregation alternately shone forth, then disappeared in the shadow, and again grew, as it were, out of the darkness, peopling the heart of the solitary woods at once. Well, as the story moves us once again out of the forest and back into the town of Salem, Goodman Brown is a changed, a marked man for life. A mysterious transformation has occurred as a result of his nighttime journey, what's often called, attributed originally to St. John of the Cross, but really more aligned with the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, nearly 2 centuries before, the dark night of the soul. This is indeed exactly that for Goodman Brown. And Goodman Brown, as a result, becomes a man of gloom, cast for the rest of his life into the dark by an encounter with evil that could well have been nothing more than a vivid and disturbing dream. Hawthorne leaves the answer to whether Brown indeed was dreaming or not ambiguous. Well, now that we have essentially the outline of the story and a feel for Hawthorne's prose, let's talk once more of Calvinism and Puritanism. Calvinism, the religion of the Puritans, is a belief in the doctrine of original sin tied to predestination and associated with such stern figures as famed Puritan writer Jonathan Edwards, whose notion was all of mankind being sinners in the hands of an angry God. Puritanism is often associated with harshness and the punitive, with sexual repression and hard work and draconic codes of conduct placed on men and women before they leave this vale of tears, as Shelley called it. But the cornerstone of belief is in God's omnipotence and his knowing who is to be saved and who is to be damned, and of all of humankind being marked with the original sin of Adam that led to the fall. Hawthorne was consumed with an obsessiveness about Puritanism and about his own Puritan ancestors. He wrote of them in a work of his called The Custom House, which is often considered an introduction to the Scarlet Letter. And it seems clear that his guilt about the sins of the fathers and his own need to exorcise that guilt is part of the genius behind young Goodman Brown. Is Hawthorne being too allegorical, as both Poe and Henry James suggested? When you call a character Faith and make her the wife of a good man who goes out on a journey to confront evil, and you move your reader into a world of deviltry that mirrors humanity, perhaps one can say Hawthorne has gone a bit to too much trouble to spell out his moral terrain. But the story, whether too allegorical or not, compels us into what Melville aptly described in an admiring essay he wrote about Hawthorne as, quote, the great power of blackness. Hawthorne transports us into the dark part of the human mind, the part that wrestles with notions of human depravity and original sin. Goodman Brown and Faith have been married for 3 months, 1 trimester, when the story begins. And the newness of their marital union suggests the ties between original sin and human sexuality. The Puritan belief in witches is seen in the story in the mention by one of its characters, Goody Cloyes, that's Brown's catechism teacher, of her broomstick being lost or stolen, perhaps by an unhanged witch, and talk of magic potions of cinquefoil and wolfbane and, quote, the fine wheat and fat of a newborn babe, end of quote. The Puritans feared and actually persecuted the Indians, whom they viewed as godless and wild pagans who were residing in the woods, and did reside in the woods. And that's, of course, the central allegorical setting for paganism. It's a place where Hawthorne tells us there is no church. There's talk of powwows in the woods, and pre-industrial America often associated woods or forests with lawlessness, as well as with Indians, who were viewed as being part of that pagan lawlessness. In Hawthorne's great classic novel, The Scarlet Letter, the act of sexual union between Hester Prynne and Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale was likely to have occurred in the forest, where later on in the novel we see Hester take off her scarlet letter, the mark of her adulterous sin, in part because the forest is free and lawless. Of course, D.H. Lawrence had a point worth considering when he suggested that imagining sexual intercourse of any kind involving the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale is not an easy task. The important point here is that in young Goodman Brown and in The Scarlet Letter, the forest is a place apart from the rules of faith and moral conduct, a place of anarchic freedom and the transparency of sin. Before we discuss the story Young Goodman Brown and its effect and meaning and value, let's find out a bit more about Hawthorne's life and who he was. Hawthorne's father died in 1808 when the author was only 4 years old, and his mother became a recluse. Hawthorne would also live an isolated life of seclusion and isolation, which shaped both his character and his vision. Though all of that would change and he would wind up a famous and prosperous man. He was an editor and a novelist as well as a short story writer. And he also wrote children's stories, travel sketches, and Gothic tales, and a children's history of the world that sold over 1 million copies but made him all of $100, the fee paid to him for the book. Later on, success would eventually come to Hawthorne, and he wound up in a relatively high diplomatic position. He was a college classmate and close friend of America's 14th president, Franklin Pierce. And in fact, Hawthorne wrote a presidential campaign biography for Pierce and was appointed by Pierce to Liverpool as U.S. consul. Hawthorne published his first tale in 1830, and 5 years later, he published Young Goodman Brown in an issue of New England magazine. The story later appeared in a short story collection of Hawthorne's called Mosses from an Old Manse. Let's talk about the story in terms of its meaning, interpret it to some extent, and its effect. It's really another horror story with the New England or Boston setting, steeped in Puritan folklore and theology, by contrast oppose Southern-nurtured Gothicism and European-set tale. The horror in this story is, of course, in the meeting with the devil, but it's also in seeing people beneath their masks and everyday appearances, including those of piety and religiosity. But perhaps the most profound horror, as I've indicated, is in Goodman Brown himself, his loss of faith, his realization of the demonic force that is within himself. Implicit in the story is the moral suasion of the depravity of human nature and the evil that resides in the human heart. The fact that Brown's conversion, after he witnesses the Black Mass in the forest, is a chilling one, and one which Hawthorne saw as baleful, really comes upon us in reading this story. And I use the word chilling because we think of Hawthorne's Roger Chillingworth, the cuckolded husband in The Scarlet Letter, who allowed his intellect to encase his heart in a desire for revenge against the adulterer, the cuckolder, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale. Goodman Brown's heart becomes increasingly encased by his sense of gloom from having seen this Black Sabbath communion that involved all of the righteous and high-bred folk of Salem, as well as his wife Faith. The loss of faith for Hawthorne was a great horror. "Faith, Faith," cried the husband, "look up to heaven and resist the wicked one." This is Goodman Brown seeing his wife at this Black Mass and telling her to resist the devil. Whether Faith obeyed, he knew not. Hardly had he spoken when he found himself amid calm night and solitude, listening to a roar of the wind which died heavily away through the forest. He staggered against the rock and felt it chill and damp, while a hanging twig that had been all on fire besprinkled his cheek with the coldest dew. The next morning, young Goodman Brown came slowly into the street of Salem Village, staring around him like a bewildered man. The good old minister was taking a walk along the graveyard to get an appetite for breakfast and meditate his sermon, and bestowed a blessing as he passed on Goodman Brown. He shrank from the venerable saint as if to avoid an anathema. Old Deacon Gookin was at domestic worship, and the holy words of his prayer were heard throughout the open window. "What God doth the wizard pray to?" quoth Goodman Brown. Goody Cloyes, that excellent old Christian, stood in the early sunshine at her own lattice, catechizing a little girl who had brought her a pint of morning's milk. Goodman Brown snatched away the child as from the grasp of the fiend himself. Turning the corner by the meeting house, he spied the head of Faith with the pink ribbons, gazing anxiously forth and bursting into such joy at sight of him that she skipped along the street and almost kissed her husband before the whole village. But Goodman Brown looked sternly and sadly into her face and passed on without a greeting. You can see the effect that this night in the forest, his covenant with the devil, had on him. When he left his wife behind, and now he has gone and sees his wife greeting him with joy, and he can't even really abide her. Had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? Be it so if you will, but alas, it was a dream of evil omen. For young Goodman Brown, a stern, a sad, a darkly meditative, a distrustful, if not a desperate man did he become from the night of that fearful dream. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation were singing a holy psalm, he could not listen because an anthem of sin rushed loudly upon his ear and drowned all the blessed strain. When the minister spoke from the pulpit with power and fervid eloquence, and with his hand on the open Bible, of the sacred truths of our religion, and of saint-like lives and triumphant deaths, and of future bliss or misery unutterable, then did Goodman Brown turn pale, dreading lest the roof should thunder down upon the gray blasphemer and his hearers. Often, awaking suddenly at midnight, he shrank from the bosom of faith, and at morning or eventide, when the family knelt down at prayer, he scowled and muttered to himself, and gazed sternly at his wife, and turned away. And when he had lived long and was borne to his grave a hoary corpse, followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession, besides neighbors not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. Well, you're certainly left with a sense of the onerousness, the heavy burden that this man carries with him from this one experience. Life can be like that, by the way. I mean, people do have those kind of experiences that turn them around and turn them into gloom, or just the opposite, certainly. One could argue into euphoria as well. But for Goodman Brown, we don't know why he went into the forest, but when he comes out and we experience what he experienced in the forest, he's a changed man. And as a changed man, his life is gloom. Now, this didn't stop him from procreating, having children and grandchildren, as we find out. But nevertheless, it's a sense of not desperation exactly, but, well, what Hawthorne called it, gloom that carries with him through the rest of his life. What happens to Brown is what Shakespeare and Hamlet called the pale cast of thought, a descent into darkness that results from intellect. Brown really can't be relieved of the effects of what he believed he saw in the forest scene, the black mass and communion feeling, and communion featuring the once angelic sable form of the devil, and the panoply of humankind, both good and bad. What is significant is that the story is spun to us in a realistic way despite its supernatural elements, and is made to include a strong didactic element, that is, a sense of teaching us about sin. You can see where Hawthorne was really, well, perhaps confused. The great Nobel laureate William Faulkner said, "Great literature is created when the heart is against itself." Faulkner had this Puritan heritage, he felt it intensely, and yet at the same time, in many ways, he wanted to relieve himself of it. He wanted to perhaps point out just how onerous and how burdensome and how much of, I'll call it a curse it could be. The story is fraught with ambiguity, and that contributes, I think, to its richness, maybe to its greatness. It's unclear at one point if Brown is seeing church members or being bedazzled by gleams of light flashing. It's unclear, though Hawthorne tells us some affirm, if the lady of the governor was there in the forest scene. It's also unclear, like with J.R. in the TV show Dallas, if you remember that, if all was a dream or why Brown needed to set out on his winter solstice journey in the first place. It's become almost trite to think of stories that are built on the pattern of a dream and that we don't know whether in ending the story it was supposed to be a dream or not. But Hawthorne was creating that ambiguity intentionally, I think, trying to give us a sense of just a dreamscape and the ambiguity of what can be imagined as opposed to what indeed may have been real. There are other, by the way, popular culture ties to young Goodman Brown, besides Dallas. There's the film The Blair Witch Project, which makes us think, I think, of the story Young Goodman Brown. There's Rosemary's Baby. Of course, stories about human encounters with the devil go back to the Bible, and from Faust up through The Exorcist and many modern tales. Brown had this covenant with the devil. That's what he discovered in the communion of his race. And that communion really represents an inability of humans, to borrow a bit from Jesus in the New Testament, to put Satan behind them. Not only couldn't he put Satan behind him, but Satan became ubiquitous in his life after he had been in the forest. And as we saw in the passage I read, he couldn't even look at those people who were giving blessings, who were trying to do God's work with any kind of a serious countenance anymore. He took them to be doing the work of the devil because they were tainted in his mind by their association and communion with the devil. And this dreamlike quality in the story is really a precursor to the surreal, because it brings a reader's unconscious directly into play. We have all these Freudian approaches to dreamlike states, Freud telling us that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, but we have literary critics like Lionel Trilling who say that you really need to put an author on the couch as much as you can. It's not only the associations in the story that are with the unconscious and dreamlike, but it's also the associations that we might find out are tied to the writer, or how they are tied to the writer. That's essentially how you would work psychoanalytically with a story like Young Goodman Brown. What's important to remember here, however, is there's a division in the story, a psychological division. The woods are id-like, unconscious. There's qualities of the mind and the whole world of Boston that represents the outer conscious self. In this way, Young Goodman Brown is kind of a harbinger, really, to Freud's famous work in the later part of his career, Civilization and Its Discontents, which one of my friends used to call Civilization and Its Discotheques. But that's a work that's really much more anthropological. The view is that civilization is driven and ultimately built by the id, by unfettered drives that are compensated for by the guilt of conscience, or what Freud called the superego. There's a multivalent message in Young Goodman Brown that shows really the thin membrane separates good from evil. Also makes us wonder if Hawthorne is indicting the Puritans or in some way implicitly affirming what they believe. One can't help but come away from reading Young Goodman Brown, it seems to me, wondering about questions of faith, original sin, and the human propensity for evil. What other elements really make this story a masterpiece, have given it its longevity and its status as a masterpiece? Well, a central theme in this work is what Hawthorne saw as the unpardonable sin of divorcing the intellect from the heart. Whether Goodman Brown experienced what he experienced in the woods or actually dreamt it, nevertheless, when he came out, his intellect seemed to take over. And that intellect taking over diminishes love or reverence for the human soul. We saw this particularly in the character of Roger Chillingworth in The Scarlet Letter. But it seems to me we see it ultimately also in Goodman Brown. And by the way, this is a story which, right from the opening paragraph, sets the mood and the tone, and both are masterfully sustained. Let me just give you an example of how that works. Young Goodman Brown came forth at sunset into the street at Salem Village, but put his head back after crossing the threshold to exchange a parting kiss with his young wife. And Faith, as the wife was aptly named, thrust her own pretty head into the street, letting the wind play with the pink ribbons of her cap while she called to Young Goodman Brown. Now notice how well structured the story is. From the beginning of the story, he gets a kiss from his wife. At the end, you remember, he avoids that kiss. The pink ribbons, which are introduced in the beginning of the story, are reintroduced at the end of the story. So there's a wonderful symmetry to the story. It's well structured. But there's also that sense initially of a kind of foreboding, of a mood that's cast early on in that first paragraph. His wife is asking him, don't stay too long. She's not questioning why he's going in there, but she wants to know that he'll return and that things will go all right and that they'll have the life that they'd had up until the time when he felt, for whatever reason, compelled to go into the woods and to enter into this dark sphere. The language is really rich. It's sometimes prosaic, but it's nevertheless Puritan speech that we hear as vernacular. And there are combined elements in this story of realism and surrealism tied to this evocation of the unconscious, and fabulism, that is, fable-like effects, within the allegorical frame that move us from out of the forest or woods to inside the forest and then once again outside to the town. The story represents a spectacular, life-transformative journey into what Joseph Conrad many years later would call the heart of darkness. And there is, make no mistake about it, a mesmerizing effect on readers as we become increasingly drawn into a world of fear and horror and loss of faith and see and feel the palpable evil of humanity and the evil communion of the human race. This story, I believe, ultimately compels us to reckon with larger questions of how we choose to live our lives. For Goodman Brown is left hopeless and in gloom at the end. Here's a story that combines galvanizing and frightening effects with this great allegorical ambiguity, didacticism, teaching us, even though Hawthorne really may have had his own ambiguous sense of what was to be taught, but certainly providing a kind of moral compass for a rich harvest of great and rewarding reading. I strongly urge more Hawthorne, the novels as well as other masterful short stories like The Birthmark, the story of Elmer the scientist who thinks his wife is perfect, but then again intellect takes over because she has a birthmark and he wants to remove it. And you know what that leads to. Never tinker with Mother Nature. And his story of sinister and gloomy guilt, The Minister's Black Veil. One can understand the nature of Hawthorne's truly extraordinary and riveting gifts as a storyteller by, of course, reading other works of his, including his novels, such as The Scarlet Letter and The Blithedale Romance. And one can understand more completely the thrust of the story's development in the 19th century by reading the stories of Herman Melville, whom I said was a great admirer of Hawthorne's, and who also, in his stories that are selected from the Encantadas, that's a collection, Bartleby the Scrivener and Billy Budd, takes us into deep psychological territory as well. But Hawthorne is the father of this deeply psychological storytelling. It extends into the present century. Stories like The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, or stories by the ever-prolific Joyce Carol Oates. And we're going to follow this path that Hawthorne provided in Young Goodman Brown as we head in our next lecture to Russia and another famous and seminal story by the Russian master Nikolai Gogol. Like Poe, Gogol was born, coincidentally enough, in 1809, 5 years after Hawthorne, and was a seminal figure in the production of the short story Far Away on Another Continent in Russia, where it also came into prominence and flourished. Gogol's story is another tale cast in realism, but with strong elements of satire and, at story's end, the haunting presence of one of the original little men of fiction, a man of seeming no consequence who wants nothing more in life than a better overcoat to have against the freezing cold of St. Petersburg. Next, one of Russia's most famous and revered short stories, Nikolai Gogol's The Overcoat. The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol, another 19th century allegorical tale of horror like Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, but based on Tsarist Russia's bureaucracy, corruption, and rigid hierarchy. There was a heightened awareness in Russia during Gogol's time, not only of the plight of the downtrodden, but of an increased sense of the importance of helping lowly clerks by making their work more efficient and, in that way, diminishing the overwhelming nature of the bureaucracy, which stifled their efficiency and their productivity. Gogol's protagonist in the story is a little man who relishes, really even loves, his work as a copier, and only faces obstacles when they are thrust upon him by the lawless who prey upon him or by the higher officials who are supposed to help him. The story is framed by the real and the supernatural. Gogol is considered the father of Russian realism, that is, employment of mimesis and verisimilitude, or creating a story that reflects real life. However, this story has comedic elements as well as surreal and fabulous dimensions. It's also a scathing satire of Russian bureaucracy and its Byzantine hierarchies of power and position. We all came out from under Gogol's overcoat. That's a statement that has been attributed variously to Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, though its actual source may have been a turn-of-the-century French critic. What it shows, however, is the impact this story had on Russian writers. And it had a great impact on Western storytelling in general, and continues to hold sway as one of short fiction's masterpieces. One can best understand a story like Gogol's from not so much a doctrinaire Marxist view, but more what we would call a neo-Marxist perspective, like that of the British literary critic Terry Eagleton, who saw a character like the downtrodden one in The Overcoat as signifying someone victimized by what Eagleton called the superstructure. Superstructure means simply the institutions that existed and made up the entire social and economic fabric, as well as the cultural gestalt, that is, the parts of the system as well as the entire system itself. And all of that really created history. So this takes us, the idea of the superstructure, into an understanding of a story like The Overcoat, because we can look at this story from the perspective outside of the text, to the institutions, to the zeitgeist, which means the spirit of the times, to really the historical period in which Gogol lived and wrote this masterpiece of a story. This is at the core of understanding much great Russian fiction, I should add, whether it's by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Turgenev, or Chekhov, the most important figure of them all as far as the short story. A major critical way into a story like The Overcoat is by looking at the superstructure, which carries with it a view of the historical period and what amounts to a dialectical analysis. Dialectic originally being a term from Hegel, but ultimately identified more with Marx, who wrote about feudalism as the thesis and conflict with capitalism as the antithesis, and for Marx the synthesis was socialism. The system of feudalism, and at its core serfdom, would be emancipated under the more egalitarian reforms of Alexander II, 21 years after Gogol wrote The Overcoat. But the liberal reform movement in Russia began under Peter the Great, and it was making headway in Russian consciousness onto the canvas of Russian writers. Suddenly, seemingly inconsequential and lowly people are protagonists in fiction by authors like Gogol and Chekhov. Pushkin, who is usually deemed the father of modern Russian literature and who was a strong believer in social reform. In fact, he was exiled because of his beliefs in social reform and his action on their behalf. And he was an enormous influence on the Russian zeitgeist and on Gogol, as was the fact that he wrote under the reign of the autocratic Nicholas I, who refused to abolish serfdom. Gogol's 1836 satire of Russian provincial bureaucracy was supposedly staged thanks to the personal intervention of Tsar Nicholas, the autocrat, perhaps because autocrats wanted a more efficient bureaucracy. Certainly Nicholas did. Let's look at this central character, or this protagonist in Gogol's famous story, Akaky Akakievich. His name means actually dung on the shoe. He's a common man, like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown. But perhaps, as the author and short story writer Frank O'Connor has noted, the first little man in fiction, a Russian schlemiel, the kind of archetypical character upon whom the soup accidentally spills. Now, this is a Yiddish folk hero. They used to distinguish between the schlemiel and the schlemazel. In fact, the great pitcher Sandy Koufax refused to pitch on Yom Kippur, the high holiday in the Jewish religion, because he said, well, to Joe Garagiola, the interviewer, former catcher, call me a schlemiel. But this character is very familiar to us. It's familiar to us in Charlie Chaplin and Woody Allen. It's usually a character who, as I said, as opposed to the schlemazel, who usually spills the soup spills on. The origin of this story, its genesis, was at a tea party that Gogol was at in St. Petersburg. The story was told there, and those who heard it laughed. But it had the opposite effect on Gogol. He was supposed to have responded to hearing it with the most pensive seriousness from everything we've heard. And Akaky, Gogol's protagonist, is just a poor document copier, someone whom would never even be noticed in this Russian bureaucratic world. A civil servant who lives and works in St. Petersburg, a man who is dedicated to his habitual and dull work routine, but invisible. In fact, the only way he's really visible is that he's teased by the younger clerks who work with him. Let me begin the story of The Overcoat and give you a sense of Gogol's prose style, but also of how he writes in so many ways that are really masterful and curious at the same time. He begins by saying, in the department of, and then there's an ellipsis. He says, but I had better not mention which department. You can see, living in an autocracy, how one can be afraid perhaps of mentioning a department, one can be afraid of bringing attention to oneself. He's also bringing attention to the kind of fiction that was making itself apparent at this particular time in Russian history, and really throughout Europe and the Western world. But he goes on to say, there is nothing in the world more touchy than a department, a regiment, a government office, and in fact any sort of official body. It's as if he wants to impress upon us just how important these departments are, really in terms of how they see themselves. And that kind of self-importance really manages to play its way into the story in a way that we find particularly compelling. It's not to say that Akaky is self-important. Akaky is just the opposite. Akaky is a man who has really no self-importance at all. All he does is copy, really. He goes home, eats and sleeps. That's his whole life. And he's happy with it for the most part, until he finds out how cold he is in the St. Petersburg winter. But here's this omniscient narrator, this narrator who knows really everything, who says, nowadays every private individual considers all society insulted in his person. There's Gogol again coming in with a kind of commentary about his own period. I have been told that very lately a complaint was lodged by a police inspector, of which town I don't remember, and that in this complaint he set forth clearly that the institutions of the state were in danger, and that his sacred name was being taken in vain, and in proof thereof, he appended to his complaint an enormously long volume of some romantic work in which a police inspector appeared on every 10th page, occasionally, indeed, in an intoxicated condition. And so, to avoid any unpleasantness, we had better call the department of which we are speaking a certain department. All of that detail, all about the police inspector, all of that circuitousness and everything to get us to the fact that we're not going to name this department, we're going to call it a certain department out of fear and apprehension. Police, authorities. And so in a certain department there was a certain clerk, a clerk of whom it cannot be said that he was very remarkable. He was short, somewhat pockmarked, with rather reddish hair and rather dim, bleary eyes, with a small bald patch on the top of his head, with wrinkles on both sides of his cheeks, and the sort of complexion which is usually described as hemorrhoidal. Nothing can be done about that. It is the Petersburg climate. This is the first time he introduces the climate, which plays a very central role as a kind of antagonist in the story. As for his grade in the civil service, for among us a man's rank is what must be established first, he was what is called a perpetual titular consular, a class at which, as we all know, various writers who indulge in the praiseworthy habit of attacking those who cannot defend themselves jeer and jibe to their heart's content. So there we have a little bit of jeering going on at the writers. And there's this self-consciousness of the narrator coming in and saying things to us in a way which we find later on in the novel, in Fielding and in Richardson, and really the birth of the English novel, to be commonplace. The now gentle reader, that sort of thing. But here's a character who needs a new overcoat. And he goes to his tailor. The tailor's name is Petrovich. And Petrovich tells him his coat can't be repaired, urges him purchase a new one. After much privation and sacrifice, and the benefit of a holiday bonus, Akaki is able to buy the overcoat, which takes on a central and preeminent importance in his life. In fact, the clerk above him throws a party. We can imagine this, a party in honor of the fact that he has a new overcoat. They're honoring the acquisition of the overcoat, but it's a luxurious one. And normally, Akaki, living a very isolated life, utterly isolated, removed from any kind of social life, attends this party. And on his way home via an unfamiliar route, he's accosted, robbed by a pair of brigands, thieves, who rough him up and leave him unconscious in the snow. The authorities are of no help to Akaki in recovering his overcoat, and ultimately he goes, at the recommendation of a fellow clerk, to see a very important person, a general, a person of consequence, as Gogol calls him, who winds up excoriating Akaki for not following the hierarchical chain of power and showing off, in fact, in front of one of his friends and how powerful and authoritative he can be. Akaki falls sick, and soon after, he dies. Well, the story concludes with what is ultimately Akaki's ghost or corpse, depending on the translation, taking people's overcoats and ultimately confronting this person of consequence to take his overcoat. The narrator, at the end of the story, tells of another ghost with immense mustaches like those of Akaki's attackers. So we have a story of a little man, a satire, insignificant man facing a world of government jobs, rank, police, district commissioner, corruption. And like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown, Akaki is an everyman. He's small, humble, meek, an underdog. But his life changes and is transformed, though only temporarily and ephemerally, with the acquisition of the overcoat. What makes this such a powerful story, what makes it such a meaningful story, and has made it that way lo these many years, is that it resonates with the humanity of Akaki. A fellow worker early on in the story says, "I am your brother." And the reader experiences this tediousness, this joyless life of the clerk, and also experiences in a rather singular way the nightmarish theft of the overcoat and the aftermath of that, and trying to seek what he has really put so much of his life into acquiring, get it back or get some sense of justice. It's a story for which it's almost impossible not to feel pathos. Gogol was often ridiculed. In fact, disparagingly, he was called the mysterious dwarf. And I think he projects some of himself onto the little man Akaki, makes his character a writer, man of words, though a copier. Herman Melville's famous story, Bartleby the Scrivener, is also about a copier. Though Bartleby the Scrivener is the character who simply says, I prefer not to, and says it over and over again, and finally becomes almost catatonic. Akaki, when he has that overcoat, feels joy, maybe for the first time in his life. Not to say that he doesn't like being a copier, because he does. He actually takes great pleasure in copying. But what we see is, in both these stories, a kind of parody of the role of the writer. Bartleby the Scrivener was published 11 years after The Overcoat, in 1853, but it mirrors The Overcoat. And probably, in some ways, as famous a story as Bartleby is, couldn't have been written had it not been for The Overcoat. What Gogol creates in the story is a mythic little man for us, a man virtually, as I said, unnoticeable throughout his life, who even when he initially began his life, did so with a sour visage at his christening. The story is set up to contrast the little, seemingly inconsequential man to the general, the man of consequence. In other words, the dichotomy of the powerless and the powerful. And the powerful treats Akaki scornfully, unconscionably, but then experiences regret and guilt, and must face Akaki's ghost or corpse before the story concludes. So let's look at Gogol. Let's look at who he was, and then we can assess more meaning in the story and the importance of the story beyond what I've said. Nikolai Gogol was born in the Russian Ukraine in 1809 to a fairly prosperous family. His father was educated and was a writer. The family name was originally Ianovsky, but Gogol's grandfather changed it in order to claim noble Cossack ancestry. Gogol was sent off as a boy to boarding school, and we know that he was physically so unattractive that he was, as I said, teased by his classmates, called the mysterious dwarf. But some of those earlier experiences certainly probably helped shape and account for his empathy for a character like this hapless and much ridiculed Akaki, who was teased, as I said, by his fellow clerks. Gogol, like many writers of short fiction we're going to be studying, wanted initially to be a poet. And one can see poetic intensity in his work, especially in The Overcoat. He had a close relationship with the great Russian writer Alexander Pushkin, and was deeply affected by Pushkin's death only 3 years before the publication of The Overcoat. Gogol settled in St. Petersburg, Russia's capital city, and there is much in the story, The Overcoat, tied to that city and its mythology, as well as to the experiences Gogol had working there at a number of minor governmental jobs. Gogol went on to work as a teacher and as a private tutor, and published a volume of short stories in 1835 called St. Petersburg Stories. The Overcoat was part of a collection called The Overcoat and Other Stories of Good and Evil, published in 1842. So there again in the title you see reflected the concern about good and evil that we saw in Hawthorne, that we saw in Poe. Gogol had enormous influence on short fiction, like Poe and Hawthorne. And he produced novels, drama, and satires, as well as short fiction. And one sees in The Overcoat a wealth of detail and a self-conscious narrator who makes us aware of the fact that he's telling a story and feels bound to follow certain specific rules he believes apply to the craft of novel writing. Now, as far as the detail, when we meet Petrovich, the tailor, we find out that he had, well, a plaster kitten with nodding head. Or we find out that there's a general's picture on a snuff box and one of the eyes are poked out. These kind of details one doesn't see in earlier stories, but one begins to see in stories by Gogol and by Chekhov, stories that were written by Russian writers. One also doesn't necessarily see until now this sense of trying to follow specific rules. That is, I should mention a character, the author says to us, or the narrator says to us, but if I do, I feel duty-bound to say something about that character that's specific. There even may be a hint of satire about writers in Gogol's making his narrator so overly concerned about keeping some data confidential and following certain strictures about what should or shouldn't be included about a character. Let's get a feel, again, of The Overcoat, particularly as we come to the conclusion. Now, I read the first few opening paragraphs, but When you get to the end, we've moved into the supernatural realm. And here again is the sense of a narrative voice that's very strong. It's not like the voice of Poe's Montresor, who's a character who plays a role in the story. Or it's not even like Hawthorne's voice, although that is an omniscient voice as well. But see if you can hear the language here, despite the fact that it's translated, and what it summons and what it evokes. What was even more remarkable is that from that time on, the apparition of the dead clerk ceased entirely. That is, from the time that he took the person of importance, Overcoat, from him. Apparently, the general's overcoat had fitted him perfectly. Anyway, nothing more was heard of overcoats being snatched from anyone. Many restless and anxious people refused, however, to be pacified, and still maintained that in remote parts of the town, the dead clerk went on appearing. And notice again how this sounds almost reportorial. It sounds almost journalistic. People are reporting. One policeman, and remember we began the story talking about the concern about policemen, so there's symmetry again. One policeman in Kolomna, for instance, saw with his own eyes an apparition appear from behind a house. But being by natural constitution somewhat frail, so much so that on one occasion an ordinary grown-up suckling pig made a sudden dash out of some private building, knocked him off his feet to the great amusement of the cabmen standing around, whom he fined 2 kopecks each for snuff for such disrespect. He did not dare to stop it, and so followed in the dark until the apparition suddenly looked around and, stopping, asked him, "What do you want?" displaying a huge fist such as you never see among the living. The policeman said nothing and turned back on the spot. This apparition, however, was considerably taller and adorned with immense mustaches, and directing its steps apparently toward the Abukov Bridge, vanished into the darkness of the night. Now notice, even though we've got apparitions, ghosts, and all that, we have nevertheless a sense of it being reported in a realistic way, in a plausible way, as if it actually occurred. It's recounted in that way. And notice the kind of detail that you get, even in the policeman being embarrassed and humiliated and charging them for embarrassing him, these 2 people, so that he can buy snuff with what he charges them. There's again the power of the law, the kind of corrupt power of the law, but the policeman himself is afraid, and with good reason. These apparitions are something to be afraid of. They're out there haunting the Russian landscape, or at least haunting St. Petersburg's landscape. Now, there are universal themes in this story. The character is isolated, and that isolation shifts briefly to his entering the world and finding an identity with his new coat. When he has that new coat, the self expands briefly beyond to a sense of richness of objects, of color, of social life, even eroticism. Akaki has a couple of drinks and the impulse to run after a lady. What I mean by universality in this is the sense that one can suddenly come from a low position and have a moment that seems triumphant, that seems joyful, that can open up the senses, open up one to life as one has never been opened up before. And really, Gogol captures this masterfully. Akaki goes in this new sartorial self, that is outwardly dressed in his overcoat, from being the schlemiel that I mentioned before to a swift experiencing of happiness, as opposed to being this unlucky character. Some of you with a good memory for Little Abner may remember in the comic strip Little Abner there was a character that Al Capp, the creator, gave us, who had a cloud constantly over his head. And certainly Akaki was that type of character. His life before the overcoat was defined by his having had garbage thrown on him, or chimney soot swept on him, or plaster falling upon his head. Those things happened to him just by dint of his existence. They happened to him because, well, for the same reason, as I said, certain characters in Yiddish literature or folk tales that go back to a lot of Russian folklore have the soup spilled on them. And there is, in the sense of Akaki, that moment of sheer triumph when he has the overcoat. He's sacrificed enormously for it. He's gone through great self-sacrifice, and he wears it. And then what happens? He's accosted, he's beaten, the overcoat is stolen. Ultimately, the overcoat, notwithstanding its wry humor and its satire of Russian life and Russian bureaucracy, is really a story about human suffering and sacrificing for a goal that is tenuous, evanescent at best. Held all too briefly, though happily, but also lost all too easily because of the evil men do. How profoundly sad that the acquisition of a coat made of cat fur should represent the most triumphant day in this poor clerk's life. It's also a tale of universal humanity on yet another level. It's a nightmarish arabesque of a man, an everyman, as I said, like Goodman Brown, who confronts evil and is destroyed not only by the evil of having what means the most to him taken away from him by robbers, but also by a kind of banality of evil. That was a great phrase that the philosopher Hannah Arendt gave us. She was talking essentially of Nazis who sent people off to their death in the death camps and then went home and put on their slippers and petted their dog, and were banal. Eichmann sending people to the gas chambers, marking them down one after another, just counting beans, really. Banality of evil. There's a banality of evil in the general, in the man of consequence, because of all his inflated self-importance, his vanity, really. He terribly mistreats this poor clerk. However, even the person of consequence reveals his humanity because he feels guilty, because he's regretful. And here in The Overcoat, we find a story of great compassion. That's why so many writers were moved by it. That's why so many writers were influenced by it. It's seen in Akaki's pitifulness and in the change also in the person of consequence. His pride and his concern about his image make him act in a way to his old friend to impress at Akaki's direct expense. But upon Akaki's death, and upon being haunted by Akaki, of course, his humanity is compelled forth, and even before that, because he feels guilty. This is a psychologically prescient story. It probes, just as Hawthorne did in Young Goodman Brown, what kind of behaviors can exist under the surface of civilized and cultured politeness. All three of these stories, these first three stories, really bring us into a world underneath the world of appearances, to a deeper sense of reality. What lies underneath appearances is often, we're told by Gogol and Hawthorne and Poe, evil, or certainly destructiveness in men's behavior toward other men. Gogol's mastery, his genius of craft, is really something that needs to be emphasized. The setting is heralded forth as a crucial element and has great immediacy just as the reader experiences the deprivation and the cold of St. Petersburg, the mighty antagonism of the northern frost. The characterization and the sketches of individual characters are really extraordinarily detailed, as we've seen never before, really. And the narrator, self-conscious, fastidious, obedient, a character in his own right, a kind of Greek chorus almost in some sense, who feels obligated to follow these rules of how to write, whether he's eschewing the indecency of mentioning undergarments, which he does, or complying with the supposed rule in novels that characters need to be completely described. And what details we get. We have a one-eyed pockmarked tailor, Petrovich. The surname is used, by the way, to indicate he's no longer a serf. He's a man whose self-image is based on feeling himself to be a special tailor, just as the person of consequence furbishes his self-image. And these richly reveal to us the nature of characters who reflect the absurdity of the social hierarchical structure in which they live and work. All in Gogol's story is hierarchically static and fixed. It's a stratified world of clerks, tailors, and those holding government posts. Details in the story are really nothing short of remarkable. Fantastic. The tailor's misshapen nail, a portrait of the general on the snuff box, good examples of the sure touch that Gogol has with detail. The fantastic ending Gogol alludes to of what he calls this perfectly true story, he insists on it being true, is what Vladimir Nabokov called a tale for the creative reader, and of social protest for the Bolsheviks, communists, a comedic tale of horror and the supernatural that paradoxically creates a feeling for humanity at the same time that it spells out in detail the futility of human existence. The greatness of this story, like Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, has much to do with its ambiguity of meaning. There have been many debates over the years about whether Gogol intended his small clerk Akaki to be a ghost or a corpse after his death. Ann Charters, who edited the much prized collection called The Story and Its Writer, an introduction to short fiction, argues that Constance Garnett, the famed translator of this story and much great Russian literature, was true to Gogol's intentions in using corpse rather than ghost to describe the posthumous Akaki. However, The apparitions that appear at the end of the tale, Akakis and the mustache figure whom we meet in the encounter with the policeman, remain part of a fantastic tableau of the phantasmagoric. Pushkin, Gogol's mentor, may indeed deserve the laurel of being the father of modern Russian literature and its greatest poet, but Gogol established a different form and voice for the short story with The Overcoat, and was a figure of colossal importance and influence on all of the great Russian writers who followed and stood on his shoulders. We leave Gogol and that apparition vanishing into the darkness to move on to one of the great 19th century stories of realism and irony that also calls attention to the plight of lesser people or common folk who seem inconsequential, but who nevertheless experience the strange turns of destiny and the vicissitudes of life and give us much universality. Our next story, Guy de Maupassant's famous well-made tale, The Necklace.